Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the National Motor Museum of Beaulieu. This evening has been put together for the Beaulieu 100 membership, who have been very loyal and supportive of us during this difficult time. And because of this difficult time, they've not been able to have the fun usually associated with the social program that we put on for them every year, nor their annual dinner or auction, which takes place in this wonderful museum and one of the highlights of your social program. In a moment, we're going to be crossing over to Doug Hill, Museum Manager and Chief Engineer, as he takes us under the bonnet of the Blower Bentley for half an hour and tells us why she is special to him and also whether it's an angel or a demon. I'm now going to hand you over to Lord Montague, who would like to say a few words before we cross over to Doug. Let's hope this goes smoothly. Good evening, Lord Montague. Over to you.
Sadly, we cannot relay the smells to you of either the cars or the cooking. The alcohol can still freely flow, but that's up to you. But let us at least make the most of the technology. And I really am grateful to the Beaulieu 100 Council for initiating this and all the work that Heather's put in. You will appreciate this is a bit of a first, but very probably not a last, as we already, of course, have another evening lined up for December. Anyway, it's good to see some familiar faces popping up at the top. Some of you just your names, some the actual faces. And well, I'm going to just, I think, like you, sit back now and hand over to Doug, who is, of course, the main turn for the evening. So over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Lord Montague. And Lord Montague mentioned the alcohol flowing freely. And I did have a sneak peek and saw some people lifting a glass of beer, which I thought was remarkably unfair. But anyway, good evening. Doug Hill, Museum Manager, Chief Engineer. And here I am with the beautiful 4.5 litre 1930 Blower Bentley. So I'm going to talk a bit about the car and talk about its makeup and a little bit of the history of the Blower Bentleys. And then we'll take your questions. And there's a few anecdotes along the way. I've been very privileged to have traveled most of Northern Europe with this car and with Edward Lord Montague. And we actually were lucky enough in 1994 to win the Monte Carlo rally with it. Not the retrospective, the classic, but the Monte Carlo for the Voiture Ancien. And so in a September rally, out of 9 special stages, we won 7. There was a bit of a controversy over that because I had a bicycle speedometer on it, and someone said I had a trip computer. On the first day when we won a stage with 1/10 of a second gap, someone took the bicycle speedometer off it and stamped on it. So there we are. But anyway, here we go. 1930 Blower Bentley. Something has to be remembered about the Blower Bentley. The blower is the compressor at the front of the engine, the supercharger. And W.O. Bentley didn't really want his cars supercharged. He didn't mind the concept of supercharging, but what he didn't like was the fact that the technology was quite new. 1923, 1924, supercharging was coming. Sunbeam Cub, for instance, driven by Seagrave, that had a supercharger. And this car, 4.5 litre Bentleys, they were great cars. Very low revving, 3,500 revs, lots of power, but they were being outmatched. They were beyond their best, as it were. They needed more oomph. The standard 4.5 litre Bentley was 110 horsepower. A racing version tuned was 140 horsepower. But when you put a supercharger on one of these cars with the Birkin tuning, normally aspirated about 180 horsepower. A normal road car, 180 horsepower, blower car. So there's instantly 40 horsepower more. And then with Birkin tuning, etc., going up to 240 horsepower. So there's a huge jump there of 120, 130 horsepower by supercharging. Now, WO had actually fitted a supercharger for a lady called May Cunliffe in 1926. So it wasn't the first. Blower Bentleys was, you know, a little bit earlier than people seem to think. But the Blower Bentleys, they were a great car, but they weren't a successful race car. 1930, the French Grand Prix, Birkin was actually one lap off beating all of the Bugattis with one of these cars. And then in 1929, these cars were so fast down the Mulsanne Straight that they kept on blowing the back tire. I say kept on. But the 6 litre, the Speed 6 Bentleys in 1930, they did 1,821 miles in the Le Mans race in 24 hours. And these things were really capable of over 1,500, 1,600 miles in 24 hours. Great, great cars. And in fact, I've driven this car from Beaulieu to Stuttgart in a day. So great long-legged car, really fabulous thing. So we have here, I'm going to first of all show you the supercharger, which is the compressor at the front. Now the supercharger, it sucks in through 2 big carburetors here. The supercharger has got cooling fins on. The original 4 superchargers didn't have any cooling fins on, but the fins actually strengthened the casing and they were producing a lot of power and they distorted. That's where the inlet goes out of the supercharger with a big check valve underneath, like the wastegate. And I'll show you little bits and pieces on that. So if we come around here, I'll open this side of the bonnet first. Now these cars are not for the faint-hearted. This is 4.5 litre supercharged overhead camshaft, 4 valves per cylinder, and consuming it about 10 to 12 miles to the gallon. Now, this is the exhaust manifold, and indeed, when you drive this at night, you can see this glowing dull cherry red. They said that Blower Bentleys ate spark plugs like a donkey eats hay, and there's a spare set of spark plugs along here. Now you'll see there's a big gap underneath the exhaust pipe. That's because we've got the gearbox out of this car at the moment for a rebuild, because since this car has been with the National Motor Museum, we estimate it's probably done between 50 and 70,000 miles. And the gearbox never was that good ever since we had the car. And we've just had the gearbox rebuilt. And the exhaust pipe, the last trip out, I'll just show you what happened. It blew out. That's from the downpipe from just here. And so just to show you the size, there's the new bit of exhaust pipe that we've had made. And it's all pretty beefy stuff. But when you think that that supercharger is moving over 1,000 square feet of air a minute, and this thing is consuming a gallon of petrol every 10 miles, and indeed I found that if you drive it really, really carefully on the motorway or the Autobahn and everything, light throttle, etc., you get about 10 miles to the gallon. If you drive it really hard in the mountains and going up and down mountains and things with it, it does about 10 miles to the gallon. So, you know, well, the hay. It's very consumptive. It consumes as much oil as it does leak. It uses about 2 litres of oil for every 500 miles, which isn't that bad. But each cylinder, and here we have a piston, each cylinder is 1125 cc, each one. So every time that this fires is 1125 cc blowing down. Now, Blower Bentleys at Le Mans they didn't fare too well. They had mechanical failure. And one of the failures was the piston crown actually collapsing because of the force that the supercharger was putting on the engine. Now, these, you have to consider that this car is 2 tons 700 weight, 4,700 weight of car. So there's over 2.5 tons, well, nearly 2.5 tons of car being hurtled down the road at 100 miles an hour, and all of that load's going through the top of 4 of those pistons. So that's a great a great idea of the amount of force. But don't underestimate the power of petrol as well, because a gallon of petrol in a controlled environment will blow this car 10 miles down the road. So petrol is pretty lively stuff. And people say it's a long stroke engine. That's the conrod where the piston goes on the top. And this is what's called a Phoenix rod, which is a much stronger conrod than the original. And that's what this engine has in it, Phoenix conrod. It's surprising, 4,700 weight, and this crankcase is made out of magnesium for lightness. But there we are. We don't want the conrod to fail. These are renowned for breaking conrods and throwing the conrod out through the side of the engine. We don't want to put that any risk. So it has a counterbalanced steel billet crankshaft. It has these Phoenix rods with shell bearings rather than the white metal bearings of the original. And that's original one, in fact, one that failed in 1992. So that's what the original looked like. I said the gearbox is out of the car. There it is, newly rebuilt. And this gearbox is a D-series gearbox. The gear change on a Blower Bentley is an art, well, on any Bentley, but once you've mastered the gearbox, it's a very, very lovely gearbox to use. Prince Michael of Kent drove this car once and he said, I don't know what's wrong with this gearbox. I just can't change gear. And I did say to him that W.O. Bentley said, don't worry about changing gear. You'll break your thumb before you break my gearbox. So, but he did master it, and a very good driver of the car he was too. So that gearbox there, which is taking, this engine is producing about 225 horsepower as it is. This gearbox is capable of taking 450 horsepower, no problem at all. So it's well within its capabilities. One interesting thing about it, all of the drive of the car is through a big fiber coupling at the back. So all of those horsepower propelling over 2 tons of car through a fiber coupling that goes on here is pretty amazing. So I'll go around the other side of the car, and if Amy, the camera person, wants to come round here and look at the dashboard, I want to show you the instrumentation. Now, us Brits, we like seeing what's going on. American cars are quite austere, I feel, on the instrumentation. I, being a Brit, I love all of this. However, I'm just going to go from left to right to show you what all of this that does. People say it's a bit aeronautical. Well, yeah, I guess so. So we have side lights here. This is a trip clock. You can actually you set the trip and set it back to 0. You put the red dot on, and then as soon as you hit that, it's starting to record on this top clock the length of your trip. This has 2 fuel systems. It has an electric fuel pump and an air system. Now, the air system is pumping air into the fuel tank, and that is done by basically a bicycle pump. And you pump the pressure up and you'll get a pressure reading on one of these gauges. And then you've got a line pressure. This is self-explanatory of the engine oil pressure. And these 2 drip feeds are to feed the supercharger. The supercharger is mounted right at the front of the car, as you saw, underneath the radiator. And it's independent of the engine. It is driven at normal crankshaft speed, but it is independent of everything on the engine. So it has a separate oil feed from the main engine oil feed. and a scavenge pump in the bottom to suck any excess oil back into the engine. But you have to regulate the oil flow. And so 10 drips per minute, as you see dripping through there, for the front bearing, and 15 for the rear bearing. And you regulate that with a little valve. And of course that changes as the viscosity of the oil changes. The Rev Counter, which, as I said, 3,500 revs, there should be a pound sign in there rather than a red zone. But this crankshaft is actually safe to about 4,500 anyway. But that is a zone where you don't really want to go to. You'll see in there is kilometers per hour, and that's in top gear, but that was the old axle ratio. We've now put a higher axle ratio, so it cruises at a higher speed. This little switch here is for the instrument light. You've got a horn button and an indicator, which is clockwork. And that just ticks away and flashes a brass contact. A electric fan, which we fitted because it's absolutely essential in modern traffic. And that's for your headlights. This is the supercharger pressure. And actually it's reading, we've got quite high pressure here today, and it's actually reading the ambient pressure. It's a little bit out anyway, it's reading it a bit optimistic. It's got an ammeter, and then 2 ignition switches, 2 magneto switches. We leave them turned on because that's the best way to leave magnetos, and oil temperature and water temperature here. Now, there's a very weird button here, which is a screw thread. And what that does is it pushes a jockey wheel down onto a brake cable, which comes directly from the brake pedal, and that shortens the cable. So as you're racing and you're losing your brakes, you wind this down and you take the slack up in the brakes, which is a very real thing in a car of this weight. And indeed, when you're driving it quite hard, you can actually take up quite a lot of slack. But massive steering wheel, and the reason the Blower Bentleys had the biggest of all steering wheels of the Bentleys, because of the 4.5 litre Bentleys, because it was the massive weight of the supercharger hanging over the front axle creates massive understeer into corners. And indeed, this car, I can go up the Stelvio pass or the Torini, no trouble at all, steering it with the throttle. But coming down, quite a lot of the hairpins, I have to take a shunt round because I can't slide the back because it understeers so much. If you look right down at the pedals, and Amy puts the camera down there, you'll see there's 2 slots because we got the gearbox out. You'll see that's the left hand was the clutch, the right hand was the brake, and that big pedal in the middle is the throttle. So it's got a central throttle, which is a bit of a weird thing, but it's amazing how quickly you adapt. And then if we go to the rear of the car, here we have a 44-gallon fuel tank. Let me just sort of demonstrate. There you go. That's the fuel tank. Pouring big jugs of fuel in. There's a seal here. And these valves are what you turn off when you actually turn these 2 valves off. That stops the tank from venting, and you can pump the air pressure into there with the hand pump. So if you have a failure of your electric fuel pump, you can just pull over to the side of the road, alter the valves on the back, and off you go again. Indeed, that happened to me when I drove it to Stuttgart because I didn't realize that the dynamo wasn't sufficiently good enough to keep up with the headlights, and I ran out of volts with the car. So I had to carry on driving just on side lights and pump the fuel pressure with the hand pump, but it was okay. This is one car you do not want to be in a motorway concertina crash, with the supercharger sitting out the front, which is about £20,000. A fuel tank, which God knows how much it would cost to have that rebuilt, but also 44 gallons of fuel. So when this is full of fuel, you've got about 18.5 stone of petrol in the back. So it's like having 2 fat relatives in the back of the car. It makes a huge difference to the performance of the car. The tires Dunlop 621s, 620s, I should say, 21s, beg your pardon, 621s, available from Vintage Tires, I must add, here at Beaulieu. That's the correct size for it. They actually run at £36 at the back and 34 at the front, and that is absolutely critical. But I found with lots of people's other Bentleys, they alter the tire pressures to sort the terrain and what they're doing, and you can alter the pressure with the added fuel in the back. As I said, the supercharger is hanging out the front. This takes quite a lot of engine power to run, and indeed Amherst Villiers, who designed this, he with my old chief engineer Louis Giron, they developed a Roots type blower that sat on the running board of a Packard, and it had an Austin 7 engine just running into the supercharger. And you'll see that it has Amherst Villiers plaque on the front, Amherst Villiers, I should say Mark IV, and that was his 4th attempt of the supercharger, and he had a royalty for each one of these superchargers fitted. But this takes away a big chunk of the cooling of the radiator. So as I said to you earlier, it fitted electric fans for modern traffic, and I've managed to squeeze 2 electric fans into the back of the radiator to make it more practical to use. It has a tiny water pump stuck at the front and 2 magnetos, one under this heat shield because it munches the heat from these exhausts, as I've already explained, is bright red, and it burns out these magnetos. Now, the trouble with cars like this, with modern fuels, is modern fuel actually burns, the flame front is about 50% higher than the older leaded fuels. And it does eat through manifolds, and it did with that downpipe I showed you earlier. Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts, for example, you can be, if you're not careful, you can melt the exhaust manifolds on those. And with the amount of gas flow, with that huge amount of air going through these, and non-detachable cylinder head, it doesn't have a removable cylinder head. So if you burn the exhaust valve seat out on one of these, it's a big problem because you've got to get specialist machines to get right the way into to machine the valve seat out and insert new ones. For sheer practicality on this car, this is where the drive for the dynamo is. And as I explained, we ran out of volts driving to Stuttgart. I actually have fitted an alternator on there, and it's got a step-up gearing on it. So the alternator, actually, this runs at half engine speed, and it's actually running at 3 times engine speed. So that brings the revs up to make the alternator work properly. And also, because of modern oils and because of the way the oiling system works, we fitted a canister fuel filter on here. So we can run on more modern fuels if needs be. Now, I showed you the con rods on this, and we are running this, and I'll go back to the con rod. We're running this on modern shell bearings in here. The older bearings were white metal bearings. And because we got these modern shell bearings in, we can run the oil pressure much higher. And indeed, these shell bearings are a Volvo Penta marine engine bearings. But it makes it much stronger, ups the oil pressure, and makes it far more reliable as well. Now, I said to you that we had to get gearbox rebuilt. I just want to show you one of the gears, and you can see where it's worn through the hardness in the gear root with all of this mass, with all of the miles. And this only runs on engine oil. The viscosity of the oil is engine oil. Now we have about, haven't had this on the dynamo, I had it on a rolling road once, and it was showing 216 brake horsepower at the rear wheels when the engine was first rebuilt in 1994. And I think it's probably around 200 at the moment. The supercharger is set to run at 12 psi is maximum. It's running at about 8 at the moment on full throttle, but the pressure is just purely on how much throttle opening you have. As it when you lift off, you've got a vacuum naturally. When you put your foot down, it actually feeds more into this, gives it more to compress, and it will compress all that you give it. It's a great muncher of air and fuel. Now I'm going to open this side and show you the induction system. Straps, by the way, on the bonnets of Le Mans cars is because they insisted there was 2 forms of securing a bonnet, not just a catch. So when you see the lovely leather straps, that was the reason they started using it. Of course, it's a great thing to have. So this is the induction side of the engine, and so no carburetors because they're right the way up the front of the car. But the induction comes up here, and these are blowback valves. If the car coughs or sneezes and you didn't have a way of getting rid of that back pressure, you could blow the supercharger off the front of the engine. It has a let's say, waste gate, as people call them these days. It has a way of regulating the pressure that it reduces. So if it goes above 8 pounds, it will dump the excess pressure. But if it does cough, which it does quite often actually, it will chuck out a huge flame out of here, fill the bonnet, under bonnet area, and subsequently the cockpit up with smoke, make everybody run in the other direction. It's very spectacular, but it has no real ill effect because of these. Here's the other magneto, one of the 2 systems. You'll see the spark plugs here, and one this side and one the opposite side, they fire across the top of the piston. The ideal is actually to have one slightly retarded from the other, so one flame travels a bit further. And if, Amy, you like to look down in here, you'll see where we grafted the alternator in there. So there's the alternator all the way down in there. So that was a great boon for Edward Lord Montague and I, because that meant that we could travel at night quite freely without it expiring on us. This is all of the venting system for the fuel system. The main fuel pipe runs down the other side of the chassis, bizarrely quite close to the exhaust. So I actually moved it across the car to keep it away from the exhaust to stop fuel vaporization. So there's a long way between the driver putting the input to the carburetors than there is to the carburetors, and there's a lot of linkage. But once you've got that all worked out, everything works well. That's great. This cable is the Rev Counter, and indeed when it's running, you can see it doing that. It's quite nice. Well, makes me happy anyway. And this little fuel tank here, this is a petrol tank. And you said, well, you won't go far on that. Well, no, you won't. But what you do is, one thing I missed on the dashboard is a little pump. It's called a Kai gas pump, and it's just a little, it says Kai gas, just the other side of the steering wheel there. And that little pump actually squirts petrol down through a pipe, straight into the engine, straight there. And so when it's cold, you give it a couple of squirts of petrol and it fires almost the first compression, because there's a long way between the carburetor and the petrol air mixture being churned through the supercharger and coming all the way up here into there. So as soon as it fires on that, everything spins up and it fires up quite instantly. So 10 miles to the gallon, 2 tons, 700 weight of car, capable of well in excess of 100 miles an hour, probably 115 miles an hour. Great on the modern roads, but understeer is a huge, huge problem. And also braking, although the brakes are good for a car of this period, this is 1930. And so it's a big lump of a car. You can imagine doing over 100 miles an hour down a Mulsanne straight at night, and then coming across a smaller car. You certainly need your wits about you. But great thing, if you think that you're going to do 1800 miles an hour, 16 to 1800 miles in 24 hours in a car like this. And once we got this back together, this car is more than capable of driving to Monaco or driving to Stuttgart or driving anywhere. It's such a great car. And indeed, I've driven this back from Monaco in 15 hours. So it does get a bit samey on the auto route, but and consumes a lot of petrol. But a great car, four-wheel braking, which is a great boon. And once you get to know the car, and people say about Spitfires, you don't get in one, you strap it on. Well, you become part of the car when you're driving this. And so they weren't a great success in the race car, but I've done an awful lot of miles with this car, had a great success with Edward Lord Montague, and although not perhaps my favorite in the museum, right up there in one of our great cars. So I hope I've given you a broad outline. There's a lot more about this car, and I could bore you for hours. However, it gives you an insight into the car and what it's capable of. And a lovely thing and a great honor to have been allowed to drive this car so many miles. And this car was given as an opening gift to the National Motor Museum Trust by Edward Lord Montague. He bought it, I believe, for £16,500. It's worth considerably more than that. And it's a great thing. And my thanks to the National Motor Museum Trust also for allowing me to drive this car and keeping it in such good working order. And thank you to David Taplin, who is being very generous and giving us an awful lot of money to keep this car in such great condition that it is. So, question time.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. That was great. I have quite a few questions that have come through. I'm going to fire off with the first one from Johnny Rockingham Smith, who has said, it's got such phenomenal power. How are the brakes? You're not allowed to say you don't touch them.
Yeah, you use the car in front, people might say. No, actually, the brakes they're adequate. They are good. You can lock the wheels up, but I remember I said to Edward Lord Montague, we were on a special stage, and I said to him, we have to do 14 kilometers down this mountain in 16 minutes if we are to get anywhere near winning this stage. Can I go for it? And he said, yes, do. On the way down, I burst a brake drum. And they're called all-fin brakes, and they've got, Amy, if you like to look down here, you can see the cooling fins on here, and they have a cast iron, a meionite lining, and that split. So they're adequate, but not a patch on modern day brakes, but they're pretty good for the day. Okay,
perfect. I've got another one from Sarah. Does the weight of the fuel tank at the back help compensate for the understeer or at the front?
It does a little bit. I mean, you still have that huge amount of weight on the front. It doesn't tend to lift the front. What it does is it sits down, and this has a big under tray on it. And when it's full of fuel, if you drive the car with a big camber on the road, the under tray will drag along the ground, and you don't want to be in a position where you're steering hard with all that weight at the back. So you try and calculate where you are as to how much. I made a huge mistake of filling it up one day and shooting up into the mountains, and it was a nightmare to drive. Better with half a tank, to be fair.
Okay. Charles White wants to know, why is it best to leave the magneto on?
Because if you leave a magneto earthed out, it is said by the magneto experts, and I'm not a magneto expert, it says the magnetism in the magnets here in the magneto, get the dust off, it weakens the magnets. So leave them turned on, and it's like having a keep plate on the bottom of a magnet.
Okay. Marcus wants to know, why is there central throttle, and do you know why this was not continued? Have I asked that right? I think I have. Does that
Hi,
make sense to you?
Marcus.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, it does. Well, do you know, I don't really know the answer to that. I mean, it works well. It's great for toe and heel braking and throttle use. And I'm not really sure. It works out well in the layout. I think it's preference, really. So, you know, I really need to, thanks Marcus for that one. I really need to delve down, and I'll come back to you later when I know the true answer. But yeah, some Lagondas had them, so I don't know.
I've got one from Russell. He wants to know whether there was any incidences with speeding at all.
Well, my lord, yeah, there was really. In 1994, we rebuilt the engine, and I took it up to the Grampian Transport Museum to run it in, which is up in Afford near Aberdeen. And I took it up there the previous day. I did the Grampian sprint meeting with the next day, and that night I drove it home. Going past Dundee, over the top of Dundee, if anybody knows Dundee, there's a wonderful road that goes over the hills, and it's dual carriageway and goes over a hill and do a big roundabout, and then another roundabout, another roundabout. And I was driving quite fast along there, and I thought, well, we've done 1,000 miles now. That's time to give it a bit of its head and clear it through. So I put my foot down, and I was looking at the exhaust glowing red hot, and I was driving down the road. And suddenly in the mirror, I saw the blue lights, and this was about 2 o'clock in the morning. And pulled over to the side of the road. Now, one thing that these things do, and when they're hot, there's a big, massive flywheel on it. And when you turn the ignition off, it fills the exhaust pipe up with unburnt fuel. And give it about 15, 20 seconds, it makes an almighty explosion out the back, just as the policeman was getting out of the car and putting his hat on. Anyway, looking quite shocked and thinking that I'd done it deliberately. He wasn't best pleased, and he came up to me and said, "Do you realise how fast you're going, sir?" And I said, "Oh, no, I'm sorry, officer. Yes, I was doing more than 70 miles an hour, I guess, but I've no idea. It hasn't got a speedometer." He said, "Well, if the car does more than 30 miles an hour, it should have a speedometer." I said, yes, but this chassis was laid down in 1929, and if the car is pre-1930, it doesn't need a speedometer. Sometimes you know you've actually pushed it too far when you talk to a policeman by the way they look at you. And he said, right, okay, well, since you've got no idea, you're doing 102 miles an hour. And you've got no way of knowing, and I'm not sure where I want you to proceed all the way down to Hampshire, because he checked the registration and where it's from, without a speedometer. He said, but what I can do is I can sit next to you, and when we get up to 70 miles an hour, which is the national speed limit, not 32 miles an hour faster, I'll put a line on your rev counter with a chronograph pencil to show you in top gear what 30 mile an hour is with your engine revs. I said, oh, thank you, officer, that would be great. So he jumped in the car, we shot off down the road. When we got to 70 miles an hour, the police car following put on its siren, put on the blue lights. The officer sat next to me, put a shaky chronograph line where the needle was, where he saw it. It was nowhere near from where I was looking. And then he said, okay, son, now put your foot down and show me what it'll really do. So I shot off down the road, and then we got to the next roundabout and we swapped over. His mate had a ride in it, and he said, now get out of Scotland. We don't want to see you again. So yeah, I managed to get away with that one. So yes, Russell, I was pulled over for speeding in the Bender.
I've got another one from Christopher McGowan. When you drove to Stuttgart in a day, the car arrived in good shape, but what shape were you in?
Rather tired. It rained every second of the trip, and it's a big beast of the car. I've got to say, that was 1994, so I was a lot younger and fitter than I am now. But I was absolutely worn out at the end of it. And indeed, the next day, I had to go and pick Edward Lord Montague up from Stuttgart Airport. Yeah, but I did, that's an entirely different, another tale of when I got to the airport, he jumped in a Range Rover because it was raining, which didn't best please me. So he shot off down the Autobahn in the Range Rover. I stopped at the side of the road and had a coffee. And then when I was traveling down the Autobahn, going past a whole load of cars and trucks. There was Lord Montague looking very sad out of the Range Rover as I went hurtling past about 80 miles an hour. But there we are. But yes, it is a very, very exhausting car to drive, especially on the Stelvio Pass. You certainly know you've done that one.
Okay, I've got one from Johnny Rockingham Smith. When will it be running again? And Paul Cable has also asked, what planned events will it be doing another rally? So those are pretty much similar questions.
Well, that's very difficult to say in this current time. This would be up and running now if it hadn't been for the restrictions and lockdown, etc., furlough of my team. So sadly, the gearbox has been out of it far too long, and I don't like seeing a car in bits. So it should be back up together, and I hoped that it would be back up for Christmas, but the simple answer is no. It will be next year. It will be up and running. As to events, this car has over doubled in age since I've been here at Beaulieu, and you have to actually think, well, we've got to think of the care of the exhibit as well. I hope to be able to do another tour with it. We've got different back axle ratio in. It's now back to its original back axle ratio, and it should be a pretty long-legged, fast touring car. It'd be lovely to get back on the road again with it. But who knows what will come up.
Thanks, Doug. I've got one from Christopher McGowan, which was how many of these particular models, to your knowledge? And also, I've got, I think it's Russell wanted to know, how did it feel like when you first drove it?
Okay, so when this car, there is for Le Mans, you needed 50 production cars to homologate the mark for the Le Mans. So there were 50 of these cars, and this is one of the 50 homologation road cars. They weren't a great success, actually, as a car to be sold. In fact, there were quite a lot of them hanging around in showrooms, and they weren't an awful lot of money. They weren't that great car that people thought they were. And this car, when it was originally made, had a Vanden Plas, what's called a close couple doctor's coupe with a dicky seat, two-seater body on it. And it was Elm Down restorations that made it look like a team car. It's one of the original chassis, but it wasn't originally a team car. And what's it like to first drive this car? Well, quite daunting, because as an apprentice and you're stuck in a car like this, which is a car that I always dreamed about, just even having the Airfix model of when I was a child. In fact, I remember quite clearly having a Saturday job at a toy store in Orpington in Kent, where I grew up, just to earn enough money to buy the Airfix kit of a Blower Bentley. And then here I was actually driving one of these on the road. So it was a daunting prospect, a big, heavy car. But you have to actually grasp the nettle and get on with it with a car like this.
Thanks, Doug. I think it was a great evening, and I'm now going to hand over to Lord Montague to finish off for us.
Well, Doug, first, thank you very much for a really interesting talk. I learned quite a bit there, and I hadn't heard your story before about your speeding incident in Scotland, so that was fun to hear. I think the message I must emphasize more than any other is that the trustees really value the support that you, the members of the Beaulieu 100, have given and continue to give to the trust. And normally, of course, the dinner is one of the ways that we say thank you. And so in the absence of that, obviously, I just wish to re-emphasize our gratitude for the support you give us, and to say that if you enjoyed tonight, we will be doing it all again, technology permitting, on the 12th of December. So please do join us again for our Christmas Skype gathering. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Bye.